How does a catastrophe that kills nearly half a continent vanish from memory? That's the haunting mystery of the Justinian plague. Unlike the Black Death of the 14th century, etched into our collective memory through paintings, chronicles, and cautionary tales, the earlier pandemic that ravaged the Byzantine Empire between 541 and 750 remains a ghost. A disaster so immense, yet barely mentioned in modern classrooms. So why was it forgotten? The first reason is narrative control, or rather, the lack of it. The Black Death had poets, chroniclers, and survivors who lived to tell the tale in detail. In contrast, the Justinianic plague struck in a time when literacy was rare, historians were fewer, and those who survived had no time or tools to record. Many of the cities and institutions that could have preserved these accounts were destroyed or severely weakened. There was no Boccaccio to write a Decameron, no vivid plague art to shock future generations. Even the most famous contemporary historian, Procopius, gave the plague only a few pages in his massive works. And when he did, it was filtered through superstition and imperial resentment. His account tells of demons, punishment, and divine wrath, hardly the kind of historical clarity that resonates across centuries. The second reason is timing. The plague arrived during the crumbling twilight of the classical world and the uncertain dawn of the medieval one. This was a time of transition, politically, religiously, and culturally. Empires were falling, languages were shifting. Pagan temples were being replaced with churches, scrolls with sermons. In that turbulence, history itself became unstable. What was remembered was what served the rising Christian worldview. Plagues were often interpreted as divine judgment, and thus best left unexamined. The suffering was repackaged as spiritual trial or forgotten altogether in favor of martyrdom stories and saints' miracles. Moreover, the institutions that might have preserved medical or governmental records, the universities, libraries, and bureaucracies, had either not yet risen or were destroyed in the chaos. By the time the intellectual revival of the High Middle Ages arrived, the plague had already vanished into myth. Then there's the most uncomfortable reason of all, repetition. The reason we forgot the Justinianic plague might be because it wasn't the last. When the Black Death swept across Europe in 1347, it was so overwhelming, so recent, that it drowned out memory of the earlier disaster. After all, what is one apocalypse when another, more recent and well-documented one, took its place? In this way, the past was cannibalized by its future. What we remember is shaped not only by what happened, but by what we allow ourselves to process. And the Justinian plague, buried under layers of collapse, religious transformation, and imperial ruin, became an echo no one wanted to hear. Yet today, that echo is returning. Modern science, particularly DNA analysis from ancient graves, has confirmed that the bacterium Yersinia pestis was indeed the same killer in both pandemics. The bodies found in German cemeteries, the sudden demographic collapses, the genetic markers of survivors, they all point to one conclusion. History repeats itself, especially when we forget it, and maybe that's the true lesson of the forgotten plague. We don't just inherit the triumphs of civilization, we inherit its vulnerabilities too. For centuries, the Justinianic plague was a mystery wrapped in dust. Historians debated whether it even happened. Some dismissed it as a myth inflated by ancient writers. Others believed it was real, but exaggerated. After all, without bodies to examine or reliable records to cross-reference, how could we be sure? That uncertainty held until a grave in southern Germany whispered a secret. In 2013, archaeologists uncovered a burial site in Aschheim, near Munich. The bodies belonged to people who had died suddenly, with no signs of violence or malnutrition. Many were buried hastily in shared graves, an ominous sign. When scientists extracted DNA from their teeth and bones, they discovered something astonishing: fragments of Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium responsible for the Black Death. This was no longer legend, it was biological fact. The Justinianic plague had returned, this time not to kill but to testify. This revelation sparked a revolution in bioarchaeology. Researchers began testing other burial sites from the same period, from France to Britain to the Balkans. Again and again, they found the same microbial fingerprint. Why? Pestes lurking in the molars of the dead, preserved across 1,500 years of soil, stone, and silence. But this wasn't just about confirmation, it was about transformation. Science gave the forgotten victims a voice. It told us how fast the disease spread, which strains evolved, and how it mutated over time. It revealed trade routes and migration patterns that connected Constantinople to remote alpine villages. It painted a map of death more vivid than any medieval chronicle ever could. Perhaps most eerie of all, the DNA of the bacterium showed a terrifying consistency. the same genes, the same virulence factors as the Black Death 800 years later. Meaning the world had been haunted by the same microbial monster twice, and it took us until the 21st century to realize it. Yet even as we uncover these truths, new questions emerge. Why did the plague disappear for centuries after the 8th century? What protected some populations while others vanished? Did human genetics evolve in response to it? Was climate change a hidden player in the outbreak, as some ice core studies now suggest? The more we dig, the more the ancient Earth seems to breathe. Crypts once sealed in darkness now yield data. Bones once mourned in silence now speak in sequences. And with each new grave opened, history is rewritten not with ink but with enzymes and polymerase. This is the paradox of the modern age. While our ancestors died not knowing what plagued them, we now understand them more clearly than ever before, and in doing so we honor them, not only with memory but with meaning. Imagine a city where death was no longer a visitor but a permanent resident. That was Constantinople in the year 542. The Byzantine capital, once a gleaming bastion of wealth, learning, and imperial pride, found itself overwhelmed, not by invading armies but by something far more silent and insidious. The plague didn't knock at the gates, it seeped through them, invisible and unstoppable. At first there were whispers of strange fevers in Alexandria, of swelling deaths in port towns along the Nile. But Constantinople, guarded by thick walls and imperial confidence, believed it was immune. It was. When the first bodies started piling up in the alleys near the harbor, the city was still in denial. Priests offered prayers. Physicians burned incense, but it wasn't enough. By the time the court acknowledged the threat, it was already everywhere. Ships brought grain and rats brought fleas brought death. Within weeks, the city's streets were filled with carts of corpses. Entire households disappeared overnight. Workers tasked with removing the dead themselves dropped where they stood. So many people perished that the authorities ran out of burial grounds. Mass graves were dug hastily, sometimes in abandoned cisterns or between city walls. When those filled, bodies were dumped into the sea, only to wash back on shore. Even the emperor could not escape the terror. Justinian himself contracted the plague. For days, the empire waited with bated breath as he lay in fevered delirium. He survived, but the city he ruled never truly recovered. Contemporary historian Procopius, a man not easily shocked, wrote of the plague with horror. He described corpses stacked in churches, markets, even palaces. He claimed 10,000 people died each day at the peak. Though that number may be exaggerated, it reflects the scale of despair. Worse than the stench, worse than the silence that followed each death, was the breakdown of meaning. Funeral rites were abandoned. Families refused to touch their own kin. The social fabric woven by centuries of tradition tore apart in a matter of days. And what of the empire? The economy collapsed. Fields lay fallow. Armies dwindled. Taxes went uncollected. Bureaucrats died in their offices, leaving no one to record the catastrophe. Trade slowed to a trickle, then stopped altogether. Cities along the empire's spine withered as fear spread faster than any caravan. Justinian's dream of a reunited Roman Empire, when he had fought tooth and nail to rebuild through wars in Italy and North Africa, died not by the sword but by disease. In the aftermath, Constantinople remained standing, but it was no longer triumphant. It became a city that remembered, a city whose streets carried the echoes of funeral chants. A city that centuries later would still whisper the word pestes with dread, and yet the records we have, thin, desperate, half-lost, suggest something deeper, that even as society fractured, people tried to hold on. Some buried their neighbors. Some cared for the sick, some prayed, and some simply endured. In the darkest chapter of its glory, Constantinople revealed its most human face, not in victory but in vulnerability. It is one of the strangest absences in our historical memory. The plague that devastated Constantinople in the 6th century killed millions across the Mediterranean and reshaped the future of Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. And yet we barely remember it. Why? Why does the Black Death of the 14th century dominate books, museums, and imagination, while the plague of Justinian, arguably just as deadly, fades quietly into the margins? The answer lies not just in the death toll, but in what survived. The Black Death exploded in a Europe with towns and cities that were beginning to keep detailed records, build cathedrals, and foster a growing sense of identity through art and writing. It struck during a time when chroniclers, monks, and civic leaders wrote everything down, so the horror stayed alive in ink. By contrast, the plague of the 6th century struck a world just barely holding together. The Byzantine Empire had preserved Roman law and grandeur, but its people were already battling wars, famine, and political collapse. When the plague came, it didn't just kill people, it killed the record keepers. Monks, scholars, administrators, and historians died in droves. Scribes who could have documented the disaster were too busy burying friends or dying themselves. Worse still, the centuries that followed were anything but stable. The empire fractured, the west grew darker, and wars consumed the remnants of Justinian's dream. Libraries burned, monasteries were looted, empires crumbled, and memory simply vanished. One chronicler, Evagrius Scholasticus, described losing his entire family. Another, John of Ephesus, wrote pages of despair, but their voices were few and scattered, and later historians either ignored them or couldn't read their forgotten languages. There was no Dante to capture it in poetry, no Boccaccio to write a Decameron, no iconic artwork depicting skeletons dancing through villages. The images that could have seared the plague into memory were never painted. Instead, it became a whispered trauma, passed down through fragmented church records and the dry language of legal reforms written after the fact. And perhaps that was intentional. Maybe the survivors didn't want to remember. Maybe they chose silence not out of ignorance but as a form of protection. Because how do you memorialize a grief so vast, so cruel, so arbitrary? How do you speak of a world where entire cities ceased to function, where bishops gave last rites to themselves, and where emperors trembled not before armies but before fleas? So history moved on, as it always does, and the first great pandemic of the Middle Ages was buried not just in mass graves but in collective forgetting. It is only now, with modern science, archaeology, and DNA analysis of ancient bones, that we're uncovering the magnitude of what truly happened. And it turns out the Black Death wasn't the first horseman. It was only a repeat performance. The original curtain rose 8 centuries earlier, and it changed the world just as much. We had simply forgotten. The plague of Justinian did more than kill, it transformed. It shattered empires, rewrote borders, and quietly seeded the chaos from which new nations would rise. In the east, it wounded the mighty Byzantine Empire beyond repair. Justinian's dream of a reunited Roman Empire died not in battle, but in silence, strangled by disease. After the plague, the empire was too weak to hold on to Italy, too drained to reclaim the West. The golden thread that once linked Rome to Constantinople snapped under the weight of death and despair. In the West, the vacuum left by dying cities and crumbling governments gave rise to something new and unpredictable. The plague accelerated the collapse of old Roman systems, economic networks, taxation, trade, but from the wreckage, the seeds of medieval Europe were sown. Peasant villages became isolated worlds, self-sufficient and inward-looking, foreshadowing the rise of feudalism. Trade routes collapsed, yes, but with them came safety from infection. Local markets became lifelines, barter replaced coin. People learned to live smaller, harder lives, and from that hardship came resilience. The church, largely untouched in terms of infrastructure, stepped into the power vacuum. Monasteries provided care when kings could not. Priests buried the dead when families were too afraid. In return, the church gained loyalty, fear, and control. Plague bred not just grief, but superstition. Fear of divine punishment, of unclean bodies, of strangers and outsiders. The Middle Ages would become steeped in these shadows, building a worldview around plague-borne fear, but it also gave rise to medicine. Primitive, yes, but desperate minds asked desperate questions. Herbalists, monks, and healers began to notice patterns, however crude. The seeds of epidemiology were there, in the panic notes of monks, in the prayers of midwives, in the scrolls buried with the dead. Most of all, the Justinian plague gave medieval Europe its first encounter with the limits of human power. Justinian had law, wealth, an army, and ambition that reached across continents, but he could not stop a flea. That single truth, the realization that emperors died just like peasants, would haunt Europe for centuries. It humbled rulers, it terrified the poor, it gave the church a stranglehold on moral authority. And it left behind a world permanently changed. So when we say the Dark Ages, we often imagine castles, knights, and ignorance. But in truth, it was shadowed by something far more human: grief. And that grief, unspoken and forgotten, still echoes in the ruins, in the crumbling walls of Constantinople, in the abandoned villages of Anatolia, and in the bones buried beneath layers of ash and silence. History forgot this plague. But the world we live in today still remembers, in ways we don't always see. Because sometimes the most powerful events are not the ones we remember, but the ones that changed everything while we weren't looking. We often begin the story of the Dark Ages with a door slamming shut, a symbolic end to the grandeur of Rome. What follows, we're told, is a time of darkness, roads falling to ruin, libraries burning to ash, and the light of knowledge extinguished by war, plague, and superstition. In our collective imagination, the Dark Ages are a pit of regression, a 1,000-year night from which Europe would not awaken until the Renaissance. The popular images are haunting. Monks hunched over crumbling scrolls in candlelit stone chambers, dirt roads lined with ragged beggars, cities decaying into ruin with wolves prowling their empty streets. And looming above it all, the constant threat of death, whether by sword, sickness, or the fiery hand of divine judgment. It is a vision drenched in suffering and silence, where fear replaces curiosity and ignorance is inherited as survival. But what if we've misunderstood this darkness? What if, in the very heart of that so-called night, there were places where the flame of civilization continued to flicker and even burn brightly? Places where scholars debated astronomy, where surgeons stitched wounds with precision, where poets crafted verse in multiple tongues, and where cities hummed with trade, architecture, and philosophy. What if we've been so focused on the ruins of Rome that we failed to see the rise of something new, something resilient, something radiant? Because scattered across continents, sometimes hidden behind deserts or perched upon forgotten trade routes, stood cities that refused to be buried by the weight of collapse. These were not accidental survivors, they were deliberate, determined centers of human endeavor, cities that read the winds of history and chose to build anyway. Some of them preserved the wisdom of the ancient world, others created their own. Many connected civilizations in ways we rarely acknowledge, all of them in their own way defied the darkness. In this episode, we'll take you on a journey through these forgotten cities, some you may have heard of but never truly understood. Others will likely surprise you. They are not just footnotes in history books. They are proof that even in the bleakest of times, humanity does not surrender easily, that even in the longest night, there are those who tend to the fire. So the question is no longer were the dark ages really dark, it's where was the light hiding and who protected it for us. Let's begin. When the Western Roman Empire crumbled under the weight of invasion, corruption, and economic collapse, many assumed the Roman story was over. But far to the east, beyond the smoldering remnants of Western Europe, the empire still breathed, though differently. Its heartbeat was no longer in Rome, but in a city straddling two worlds, Constantinople. Founded by Emperor Constantine in 330 CE and christened Nova Roma, it would come to bear his name and far outlive its western sibling. By the early Middle Ages, while cities in Gaul and Britannia faded into obscurity, Constantinople remained a thriving metropolis, cosmopolitan, fortified, and magnificently adorned with domes, mosaics, and palatial halls. To many in the Latin West, the city was an enigma. Was it Roman? Was it Greek? Was it something entirely different? It was all of these and more. Surrounded by the mighty Theodosian walls, triple-layered defenses that would repel siege after siege, Constantinople stood not just as a military stronghold, but as a cultural sanctuary. While knowledge flickered elsewhere, this city kept the embers burning. Its libraries held precious scrolls of Plato, Aristotle, Galen, and Euclid. Its bureaucrats wrote and preserved laws in Greek and Latin. Its artisans refined architectural marvels that had no parallel for centuries, none more iconic than Hagia Sophia, a dome that seemed to float above the earth, whispering heaven down to those below. Inside this metropolis, East met West and religion merged with state. Emperors sat on golden thrones, seeing themselves not merely as kings, but as God's chosen stewards. The Orthodox Church flourished in its own right, evolving differently from the Latin tradition. Chanting echoed through cavernous basilicas, processions glittered with incense and iconography. This was not the dimness of medieval ignorance, it was a different kind of light, one that the West, in its disrepair, struggled to recognize. But Constantinople was not untouched by fear. Though it shone brightly, it was also under constant threat. From Slavic tribes, Arab navies, and even Latin crusaders who would one day betray it, the city stood like a candle in the wind. It was this tension of brilliance standing against the dark that made it a reluctant beacon, not triumphant, not invincible, but enduring. Even in its contradictions, Constantinople dared to be luminous when the rest of Europe seemed wrapped in shadow. It translated ancient texts, it debated theology with an obsessive precision. It held markets where Persian silks touched Norse furs. It became, without ever asking for the title, the most vital city in Christendom. When we talk about forgotten cities that defied the darkness, we must begin here, not because Constantinople was obscure, but because modern minds too easily relegate it to the past without grasping what it preserved for us. Without Constantinople, there would be no Renaissance. Without its stubborn refusal to collapse, much of the ancient world would have been lost to time. And so, while Europe slumbered through feudalism and famine, Constantinople kept watch, alone, proud, and quietly heroic. While much of Christian Europe was still cloaked in feudal dust and lit only by the flickering flame of Latin scrolls hidden in monasteries, far to the south, across the Pyrenees and into the sun-drenched land of Al-Andalus, a different kind of light was shining. Cordoba, to the average medieval European, the name might have sounded foreign, perhaps even heretical. But in truth, Cordoba was once the most advanced city in all of Europe, and arguably the world. In the 10th century, under the reign of Caliph Abd al-Rahman II, Cordoba wasn't just a city, it was a civilization within walls. Home to nearly 500,000 people, while London and Paris barely scraped a tenth of that, Cordoba was paved with stone streets, lit with oil lamps, and flowing with water through aqueducts and public baths. While many European peasants still lived in wooden huts without windows here, scholars debated astronomy under domed ceilings, and poets recited verses beside fountains fed by underground channels. But what made Cordoba miraculous wasn't just its scale, it was its soul. The city was a melting pot of minds. Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived side by side, sometimes uneasily, yes, but often in vibrant, if fragile, cooperation. In an age when the church in Rome was suspicious of inquiry and deviation, Cordoba embraced intellectual plurality. The great library of Cordoba was said to house over 400,000 manuscripts, dwarfing anything in Latin Christendom. Here, philosophy was not feared but cultivated. Thinkers like Averroes Ibn Rushd dared to resurrect Aristotle when Europe had long buried him. Maimonides, the Jewish philosopher-physician, wrote his greatest works in Arabic, contributing to medicine and law for generations to come. Mathematics, chemistry, anatomy, geography, they were not separated by walls of religion, but stitched together under the idea that knowledge was divine. And while many in northern Europe saw disease as punishment from heaven, Cordoba's doctors were performing cataract surgeries, writing medical encyclopedias, and refining surgical tools. The architecture reflected this grandeur. The Mezquita of Cordoba, with its forest of red and white striped arches, stood not just as a house of worship, but as a temple to human ingenuity. Every column whispered, "We have not forgotten the ancients, we are speaking with them still." But Cordoba, like all lights in a world that mistrusts fire, could not burn forever. By the 11th century, political fractures and internal strife began to tear at the fabric of Al-Andalus. The Christian Reconquista crept ever southward. The Golden Age faded, not because Cordoba was defeated in war, but because it lost the will to protect its own brilliance. Scholars were exiled, libraries burned, and tolerance became a memory. Still, for a brief, extraordinary window in time, Cordoba defied the idea that the Dark Ages were universally dark. It was a contradiction to the narrative. A flare of elegance and intellect, a reminder that even in medieval times humans could dream, not of heaven alone, but of a world where beauty, logic, and faith walked hand in hand. To forget Cordoba is to forget that not all of history's light comes from the West. In the minds of many, the medieval world is a map where light fades the farther you move from Rome. But that's because the map we inherited was drawn by hands that never ventured far enough east. Because had they looked beyond Byzantium, across the great deserts and Fertile Crescent, they would have seen a city that didn't just resist the darkness, it redefined what light could mean. Baghdad, founded in 762 by Caliph al-Mansur, it was no accident of trade or tribal power. Baghdad was designed, meticulously built as a round city, a circle of symmetry and science, at its heart. The House of Wisdom, or Beit al-Hikmah, not just a library but a civilizational engine. Imagine this, while Viking raiders sacked monasteries in the north, in Baghdad, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Zoroastrian, Hindu, and even Chinese scholars sat at the same tables, translating texts from Greek, Sanskrit, Syriac, and Persian into Arabic. They weren't just preserving knowledge, they were transforming it. Names that medieval Europe wouldn't recognize until centuries later were already celebrities here. Al-Khwarizmi, the father of algebra. Ibn Sina Avicenna, whose canon of medicine would be taught in European universities for 500 years. Alhazen, who figured out the fundamentals of optics and light centuries before Newton. Al-Razi, who differentiated smallpox from measles and pioneered the use of alcohol in medicine. And it wasn't just science. Baghdad was the cultural heartbeat of a civilization that embraced the unknown. Philosophy, poetry, music, metaphysics, everything was fair game. People debated Aristotle in coffee houses and recited verses from Rumi and Hafez under moonlit domes. Here, questions were not punishable, they were sacred. But perhaps the most astonishing thing, this explosion of learning and creativity happened at a time when most of Europe had forgotten how to build stone bridges. Baghdad had hospitals, postal systems, night patrols, sanitation plans, and even public hospitals that treated rich and poor alike. It was not just a city of gold and domes, it was a mindset. A radical belief that the universe could be known, that God would not be offended by inquiry, and that truth had no nationality. And yet, like all golden ages, it stood vulnerable to the very forces it defied. In 1258, the Mongols arrived. Hulagu Khan's army laid siege, and after weeks of horror, Baghdad fell. The Tigris ran black with ink and red with blood. The House of Wisdom, centuries of human thought, was reduced to soggy parchment and silence. It is said that so many books were thrown into the river that the water ran dark for days. But what Baghdad left behind was more than architecture or libraries. It left a blueprint. It proved that curiosity could build empires, that pluralism wasn't weakness, it was strength. That the so-called Dark Ages were not dark everywhere, only in the places where light was feared. While Western Europe stumbled through fragmented kingdoms and feudal uncertainty, there stood one city, magnificent and defiant, that refused to collapse into the chaos. A city that called itself Nova Roma, the New Rome, but history would remember it by another name, Constantinople. Perched on the edge of two continents, Constantinople wasn't just a city, it was a statement. A shimmering fortress of marble, gold, and relentless willpower that declared, Rome is not dead. Founded by Emperor Constantine in 330 AD, the city grew into the beating heart of the Byzantine Empire, an empire that was Roman in law, Greek in culture, Christian in soul, and military in muscle. When the Western Roman Empire fell in 476, Constantinople did not mourn, it fortified. By the early Middle Ages, while most of Europe's roads fell to ruin and aqueducts dried to dust, Constantinople still had running water, street lighting, and a navy that could scorch the sea. Let that sink in. In an age where most cities feared fire and famine, Constantinople wielded Greek fire, a terrifying weapon that could ignite even on water. Its formula remains lost to this day, a well-guarded secret that turned the city into an unbreakable bastion. When invaders saw it, they didn't just retreat, they ran screaming. But military might wasn't the city's only brilliance. This was a place where law lived on. The Corpus Juris Civilis, or Justinian Code, born in Constantinople in the 6th century, became the backbone of modern European law. That's right, many of the laws that govern the West today trace their lineage not to medieval kings, but to the codices drafted beneath the golden mosaics of Hagia Sophia. And oh, Hagia Sophia, step inside and your breath halts. This was not a church, it was a cosmic encounter. Built in just 5 years, unbelievable for the time, it held the world's largest dome for nearly 1,000 years. It was a statement of power, beauty, and divine ambition that dwarfed the crude wooden chapels of the West. In Constantinople, scholars preserved not just Greek classics, but mathematics, astronomy, medicine. It was in Byzantine hands that the flame of Homer, Plato, and Euclid endured. Without them, the Renaissance may never have happened. But perhaps the most ironic truth, to many in medieval Europe, Constantinople wasn't a symbol of salvation, it was a threat. Its Orthodox faith clashed with the Latin West. Crusaders who were supposed to protect Christianity sacked Constantinople in 1204, looting its sacred relics and desecrating its churches. The city survived, but it never truly recovered, and yet it held. Through wars, betrayals, earthquakes, sieges, it held, until 1453. When Mehmed the Conqueror breached its massive Theodosian walls after a 53-day siege. The fall of Constantinople wasn't just the end of the Byzantine Empire, it was the end of the ancient world. But Constantinople never truly died. Its laws, its wisdom, its art flowed westward, carried by refugees and exiled scholars. And in doing so, it sparked the Renaissance, a strange twist of fate where the city's fall became Europe's rebirth. In a time called dark, Constantinople was the star that refused to go out. It didn't just defy the Dark Ages. It embarrassed them.